Good morning, everyone. I am David Millington, the Director of Education at Next Level Purchasing Association, and I would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here and to deliver this webinar to such an illustrious group of procurement professionals. Today's retention webinar is going to be on executing a global sourcing strategy, and it's part one of a four-part series. So, some house cleaning. Today, I would like today's webinar to be highly interactive, so feel free to send any questions you have in the chat box as we go along, as I go through the different sections or different slides. Normally, we do the Q&A at the end, but I would like to change that a bit, and we would do the Q&A at any point that you feel that you need some sort of clarification. So please send your questions in the chat box as you see fit. So procurement, as we know, has taken a center stage in a global arena. Gone are the days where the bulk of the procurement activity would be within the borders. Now it seems as though in many aspects and in many industries, procurement on a global scale, on a global magnitude of a global order is the norm. And there are many reasons that companies would choose to procure globally and would have to deploy an effective and robust global sourcing process and strategy. And one of the main reasons that companies choose to go this route is cost and cost reduction. So with that said, as we know, as procurement professionals, once we get past the determining of a need to bring in the critical inputs and raw materials to feed our conversion processes and selecting our suppliers, then comes the activities that are underpinned by moving those raw materials and inputs and goods and services from the supplier to the end use to our process. So with that said, a big question that we have to focus on in terms of the arena of global procurement and global sourcing is who should handle global logistics. It's a very, very, very wise question, and it's a very, very necessary question to ponder on. So many procurement professionals, they have chosen to allow the shipper to handle much or the bulk of the logistics function as far as moving those raw materials and inputs from their site to the site of the buyer. But this question should be viewed from many dimensions and many perspectives. So the question of who should handle this, I think it depends on the relative size of the buyer and the seller. So the larger the buyer, they may be able to procure lower rates. So we as procurement professionals could leverage and benefit from the economies of scale from our suppliers being large enough or bigger than us, larger than us, and they would be able to provide us with a more robust and competitive rate. But there are many situations where many organizations, even on the buying side, they're also large exporters of goods and services, and they prefer as a preference to handle the entire spectrum of the global logistics function, moving the raw materials from across borders or from overseas. If you're procuring in China or Asia or Europe, there's a preference for some companies prefer to handle the entire spectrum because of their size. So there's that preference. So some suppliers and buying organizations handle their logistics and their shipping functions as profit centers. So there are these considerations to look at to see if we should handle the bulk of the global logistics functions ourselves, or to use freight forwarders or custom brokers, or to let the shipper handle the bulk of those functions and those activities. But for sure, as we see at the bottom of the screen, rule of thumb is to check with the supplier's proposed shipping costs against the rates that you can get, for doing yourself, for handling the activities yourself. So while it is sometimes better to let our suppliers handle the shipping, the buying company may want to handle the customs clearing operations themselves. So I would like to differentiate and make a distinction between the shipping functions and the activities that underpin the shipping and customs clearing operations. Okay, so I think the focus on this webinar is we're going to focus on the distinction between the two. So I think in many cases it might be best for to have the supplier handle the shipping functions, and we're going to go through the process in the next slide. And it might be better and more prudent for us as procurement professionals or the buying organizations to handle the customs clearance themselves, especially when it's at their ports, because as buyers we'll be more familiar, more familiar with the formalities of our customs clearance processes. So it is very important that we understand flow of materials throughout the process, that we understand the total flows and the mechanics of our supply chain functions from the entire sourcing process, the entire processes, the manufacturing processes, and the conversion of raw materials to inputs, and we understand the logistics functions, and we understand the entire end-to-end spectrum from understanding our customer requirements. And it all starts with understanding our customer requirements and understanding our value proposition and understanding the procurement processes itself, the conversion processes, the logistics processes, and even reverse logistics processes. It's very important that we understand these elements across the board. The better we are at understanding the underpinning of our function as procurement professionals, which is to deliver, to assure that we are capable of providing our conversion processes with robust, high quality raw materials and inputs to our conversion processes. The better we are at understanding this and understanding that they must meet the customer requirements and customer criteria, the better we are at understanding those elements, the better we will be at doing our job. And I function and I focus on our core mandate as procurement professionals in every webinar, which is to what? To manage spend, to support operations, and to protect our organizations from risk. So it is very important that we understand all the intricacies involved, especially lead times and the time elements as far as our work is concerned. And I see I have a question whether okay, so I have a question here. Whether to generally handle the logistics functions internally, or should it, hold on, I'm sorry. Let me, oh, here it is. Do you think there should be a strategic decision about whether to generally handle logistics functions internally, or should it be on a case-by-case basis, depending on whether the buyer or seller can get better pricing and is better positioned to negotiate the relative terms in a particular instance? I believe that we should look at all of our activities and our decision-making processes from the 80-20 perspective and the 450 perspective. And what I mean by that is all our key decisions, we will find that 20% of the factors and variables in our organization will drive 80% of the impact, the cost impact, and 4% of the factors and variables in our environments will drive 50% of the impact. So, for example, 4% of the elements in or factors in our organization, our supply chain, would drive 50% of the cost. So, in terms of to answer this question, if it should be on a case-by-case basis or as a strategic decision overall, the general strategic decision, I think we should look at the inputs, right, and understand the criticality of those inputs, and understand if the inputs that we're procuring from overseas or cross borders, if they're showstoppers or not. So we look at that 80-20 and that 450 dimension, and if you realize that if, for example, if you could hone in on what are the 20% of raw material inputs that if there is a disruption would drive 80% of the negative impact on our supply chain. And then if we look at the 4% of the raw material inputs that would drive 50%, as the 450 rule, 50% of the negative impact if there's a disruption in those raw materials, right? They would drive 50% of the negative impact. I think we may want to look and look at this situation here in terms of cost and how we should make the decisions whether to handle internally or externally. If we have the core competencies, that's one consideration. Do we have the core competencies internally? And the other question is, in terms of, as I mentioned before, of criticality, do we really want to if we don't have, or we cannot ensure and that we could mitigate all of the risk, concern, and we can assure that there will be no disruption by us handling these sensitive logistics functions ourselves. And if we could ensure that there'll be no disruption, that's fine. I think it should be an 80-20 and a 450 decision. We look at those raw materials that have the most significant negative impact if there's a disruption, if we drop the ball along the line, because international procurement is highly complicated. There are many steps and there are many variables involved, and there are many potential points of failure. If we could ensure that we have all of those points of failure covered, then and we have the competency to ensure that there'll be no disruption, then we could handle those functions ourselves internally, as we could reduce cost. But we have to look at the bigger picture. If there's a disruption, or if for whatever reason there's a breakdown in our processes at any point in time, again, we look at the nature of the criticality of the materials themselves, right? Those 4% of inputs that would create 50% negative impact on our total supply chain, and the 20% of the raw materials and inputs that will create 80% of the negative impact due to this disruption, or if our processes fail. So I think we should look at it that way. And then there may be other items that are not as critical to our mission, or mission critical inputs, to save costs on those ends. And that end, we may consider if we have a degree of competency to handle those functions ourselves. I hope that answers the question, but it depends on the show-stopping inputs and raw materials, and again, the criticality, and to understand and to rank and to classify all of our inputs by degree of criticality and by degree of a negative impact in terms of disruption to our supply chain. I think we should look at it that way, and make a decision not only on price. We have to look at the bigger picture in terms of the cost of disruption to our supply chain. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so on to the next slide. Okay, so here we see the global logistics process. So step one would be to pick up the products at the supplier site and to deliver them by either plane, rail, or land, sea, or air to the port of exit. The products must clear export customs, and this usually happens at the port of exit. Step three, load the goods on a plane, ship, truck, or train, and bring the goods to the port of entry by the importing country's customs operations. Step four, customs clears the goods. And step five, a local carrier delivers them to the buyer's location. So again, step one, the product is picked up at the supplier site, delivered to the port of exit. Then there's the export customs process. The products must clear export customs to leave the country. Right, so if it's from Asia to leave, let's say China, to leave China, the products must clear export customs. Then the third step is to load the method of shipment, be it a plane, ship, truck, or train. And then the products must clear customs at the in the buyer's country. And then from the customs, once those products are cleared, the customs process, then a local carrier delivers them to the buyer's location. So one of the key things, and I mentioned in many of the webinars, that we should focus on, which with every process, what I call SIPOC, suppliers, input, process, output, customers. Okay, so every process, a transactional process, a manufacturing process, has these elements of suppliers, inputs, process, output, customers. So the reason why this SIPOC methodology is so important in terms of it allows us to look and see who are the suppliers to each step in a process, and then what are the critical inputs to be leveraged and processed to create a specific output. So in terms of the global logistics process, yes, it does have suppliers, input, process, output, customers. So this here, step 1 to step 4, is the process. But for these process steps to be executed, there are critical inputs that go into those processes. Documentation, it could be some software, methods of technology. And so it's very important that we have a understanding of the critical input variables and the processes themselves. And what I mean by this is, for example, picture that the goods leave the supplier site and get to the export customs function, step 2. And picture the documentation is not visible or clear. So the documentation would be, or the paper documents would be an input for the customs functions to execute step 2. Now, delays, severe delays could occur if the inputs are not correct, if there's critical information that's omitted, or if the documentation is not legible, then there could be a delay in the entire system or the process. And any delays that we have in our supply chain drives cost. So it's very important that we understand and we be assured that the freight forwarders, if you're using custom brokers, the suppliers, all parties involved in these processes, that their processes are robust and the inputs are correct and the inputs are easy to understand, they're legible. And because if you have faulty inputs, even if you process them incorrectly, you're going to have a faulty outcome. And any outcome in a system like this could create disruptions and costly delays. So again, I urge you to leverage the SciPuck methodology. You could put this in an Excel format, and you write down each step in the process and all of the critical inputs and who are involved, and you assess them and you make sure that every variable is in place and every variable is robust. If we do this, then we would have a good outcome. If the inputs are incorrect or the inputs are subpar or compromised, even if processed correctly, then our outputs, our desired outcomes would be compromised. So it's very, very important that we have understanding and a good visual of all of our inputs and our process variables with every activity in the procurement function, including this one, especially this one, because of the nature of the complexity of international procurement. So we have to understand the available support and the resources that we would be able to leverage to move things along if we realize that we do not have the internal capabilities to handle global logistics. And they come from two major types. That would be freight forwarders and custom brokers. So the function of a freight forwarder is to arrange the documentation and to arrange the pickup of the goods and services, from the supplier's factory to deliver them to the port of export, or to handle the entire function. You leverage a freight forwarder, including the customs process in the buyer's country. So the freight forwarders can handle the entire end-to-end process. Again, we have to understand if we're trying to the cost parameters that are concerned with that, and then we have to look at the bigger picture in terms of of competencies. If we think we have the competencies to handle these functions and we could reduce cost and we could ensure, again, there would be no delays or disruptions, then we may want to handle a lot of these functions. If we cannot ensure with a high confidence level that that there would be no disruption to our supply chain, then if we cannot ensure that, then we may want to use a freight forwarder and or customs broker. So freight forwarders could be very, 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 very useful and could take a lot of the pressure off of the procurement departments. You know, they would facilitate the entire tracking and moving the process along. Also, customs brokers are very, very useful, sort of prevalent in North America and Asia, but not as much as in Europe. And they could work, a lot of times they work in tandem with or integrated with the freight forwarders, or they could work in parallel as separate functions. But they are also a very, very critical and valuable link in the chain, and they are very, very useful in terms of providing advice on a lot of the classifications and that would be required in the process. They also pay duties to the importer and notify the importer if there are any issues along the way. So, when to leverage air freight or the different modes of transport? Again, we have to understand our value chain and our value stream, and we have to understand the entire logistics process from a cost perspective. So if we have the capability to look at each process in our value chain, the end-to-end, and understand and plug in the time elements from one step to the next. And if we're able to, and once we're able to extrapolate and understand the time elements, we will be able to put a cost to that. And then we have to look at the bigger picture. Again, in terms of if we as procurement professionals are going to handle the entire process, the cost of, we have to look at the cost of failure, and we have to look at and understand the ability to detect if any one of those processes are going to go into failure mode. And we have to look at the big picture and understand the degree of occurrence of breakdowns and failures in the processes. If we're using freight forwarders, using customs brokers, if there's a high degree of failure from one freight forwarder to the next versus us doing it ourselves, we have to be able to assign a dollar cost and look at the cost benefit to us as procurement professionals handling the entire spectrum ourselves or leveraging these support functions. So in terms of air freight, many times air freight would be used to expedite raw materials because maybe there was some type of there could be many reasons for that. You know, there could have been some type of ordering or inventory discrepancy. Sometimes we realize that we're out of stock and we need to get some type of emergency delivery. Or it could be that we were shipped the defective materials and we still need to support our manufacturing processes because we have to meet the requirements of our master production schedules, and we can't alter that. We have end users or customers that have set schedules and they have their requirements and they place the orders and they're expecting to get their deliveries on time. So in this case, we would have to probably use some form of expediting those raw materials. A lot of times it'll be air freight, but this could be very, very extremely costly. So, but there are times where it'll be more prudent to use air freight. So, sorry. Let me go back. Yes, so as a rule of thumb, we should make sure that we avoid air freight as much as we can, because it's very, very, very expensive. So if we have to make sure that our inventory mechanisms are robust, we have to hold our suppliers accountable for assuring that they're shipping materials that are high quality, low defect rate, so we don't run into these situations where we need to expedite raw materials using air freight. Yes, it's quick, but it's very, very, very expensive and could be cost prohibitive. So ocean freight, pretty much a better choice, and is heavily used for goods that are cost prohibitive to ship by air. And usually this is done in what we call a containerized methodology. So the total cost to move a 40-foot container from port to port intercontinentally and to deliver to customs will be approximately $2,000 to $4,000 US dollars in most cases. Ocean freight, one of the critical questions that comes up is, should we ship full containers or partial containers? That is a big question that comes up from time to time, and I would say, and usually it's the best decision, but I would say sometimes it depends. We have to understand that I've seen many cases where supply chains are overstocked because we want to meet the full container load, even if we don't need it. And we have to look at the carrying cost. We have to look at the exposure of our supply chains and our organizations to shrink, to inventories being damaged. We have to look at the fact that unnecessary inventories or being overstocked with inventories, we could be in a situation where some of those inventories expire. We have to look at the cash that's tied up by having unnecessary inventories. So we have to look at this in a very, very balanced approach, and of course the carrying cost. So we have to look at, yes, on one side we would make a savings and leverage economies of scale, but on the other side we have to look at the carrying costs and tying up of cash flows. We never want to put our organizations into what we call a negative cash flow situation. Do I have any more questions at this point? Are there any more questions? Okay, so I'm going to move on. So yes, so full container load, to make that decision, yes, in many cases it's the right decision, but we have to look at what we call the total cost of ownership. We have to look at the carrying cost of having excess materials. Maybe all we need to meet our requirements would be maybe quarter of a container or half of a container. I understand, yes, if we do the full container load, yes, we would be able to leverage economies of of scale and yes, get lower rates. But we have to look at the big picture in terms of, would we have unnecessary inventories? Would those inventories be exposed to damage, to shrink? How would those extra materials impact our carrying cost? And how would they affect our cash flow position? So we have to look at the total cost and the total cost of ownership, and always assure that our decisions create a situation where our cash flow position is positive. We never want to negatively impact our organization's cash flow position. So as I mentioned before, it's very important that we understand everything in terms of time, quality, cost, our triple constraint. And you want to make sure that the methods that we're using have, and the organizations that we have as support functions, our brokers are efficient, our freight forwarders are efficient, our suppliers, that they're able to meet, our overseas suppliers or manufacturers, they're able to meet their manufacturing schedules on time. Because every delay that we have would create some type of negative cost impact. So this is a table that looks at transit times, from ocean transit times, from port to port, country to country, and in terms of the days and the lead times. So understanding our value stream and understand your value stream is very, 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 very important in the procurement function, and in terms of the impact of the global logistics function and procuring items globally or overseas or cross borders would have on our organizations. So the better we are at, as I mentioned before, understanding every component in our value chain, in our value stream, from a time perspective, where products are sitting, where there could be potential delays, what are the time elements of each function in the process, in the entire value stream, is very, very, very important. So the value stream mapping is a very, very, very awesome tool to give that level of visualization of how materials move from one point to the next. Here we see this value stream or value stream map is for a manufacturing process, but it could also be adapted for to look at the processes that our freight forwarders would use, our customs brokers would use, and the entire logistics function we could map out using this methodology. So we see here process A, which is a manufacturing process, process A, process B, process C. We see here the time spent to process a certain amount of goods. We see 300 seconds. Process A takes 300 seconds to produce a certain amount of a certain output. And then we see that output sits for 4 days before it goes to process B, which the timeline to execute the required quantity for the output of this process is 45 seconds. And then it sits for 1 day before it goes to process C. And then from this process, it sits for 3 days. So we see the entire processing time, the materials flow. We see here the processing time is 585 seconds in terms of processing time, the individual steps in the process. Very, very quick. But we see the entire lead time, the entire end-to-end process is 14 days. And that's because of the gaps in between the process steps. 4 days, 1 day, 3 days, and over here, 6 days. So it's very, very important that we understand the materials flows in terms of time and cost impacts. So as far as, and we could go as far back as we would like. We could look at the procurement process. We could, and then we could tie it into our manufacturing processes and our logistics processes. We could go as far back as our suppliers, and we look at that end-to-end process, and we look at each process step and the time consumed by each process step, and then the time that item spent in between the steps is where, right here, in between process steps is where a lot of time gets consumed. And if you understand those, and we could figure out ways to improve and to reduce time, improve our processes, and find ways to reduce the time elements in between the processes. This way we would shorten our lead time. So in terms of security, it's very, very important that we understand the security elements and understand that many countries have adopted measures to prevent terrorists from putting dangerous materials, compromising our supply chains by putting dangerous materials on shipments. And we have 2 major initiatives: the Authorized Economic Operator, the AEO, and then we have the CTPAT, that's the Customs Trade Program Against Terrorism. The CTPAT, if we're able to get that designation for our organizations, we could cut considerable time in terms of how the products and our products enter and exit the customs process. We could reduce time. Again, understanding the entire value chain, end-to-end process, looking at the times, the times that it takes to execute each step in the process, and understanding where the bottlenecks are, where the delays are, and putting in the necessary risk mitigation strategies to assure that there are no delays. So some key points for understanding. Some key points for understanding would be that we should take responsibility from clearing the goods through customs in our countries as much as possible. If we leave this to a supplier from overseas who may not understand the intricacies of the customs clearing process in your country, we may be putting our supply chain at risk of delay. I understand that shipments should be handled by the party who could do it the cheapest and most effectively, to answer the initial question, and that is based on core competency. If we have the ability to handle these functions without delay and without especially delaying mission critical raw materials and inputs that have a high degree of criticality, if we can ensure that there'll be no disruption, then we could handle and be capable, we could handle those functions ourselves. If we're not sure and we don't have a high confidence level that we would not disrupt our supply chain, then we would want to place the necessary functions or activities that we don't have core competencies in the hands of others, in this case, freight forwarders or custom brokers or the supplier who can handle those functions that we're not comfortable with. So, do we have any other questions at this point? Any further questions? Okay, I don't see any other questions. We should assure that we set goals for our customs operations. And the median time should be less than 1 workday, right? This is as a rule of thumb. Very important that, again, that we assign responsibilities, roles and responsibilities to those who can best handle the process steps and the work and the activities involved in the global logistics function. We look at that relative to the cost and relative to the cost of non-conformance and not meeting our targets. So who should handle customs operations? Again, in most cases, the buying company organizations should handle the customs activities in their country. I strongly recommend that, again, as we may be in a position to better understand the intricacies of the customs process in our own countries, as opposed to the supplier or an organization from overseas. So do we have any more questions? Any questions, any Q&A? And customs officials usually perform 4 functions. They classify goods and check the importer's classifications of the goods. It's very, 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 very important. Custom brokers, they're very versed and very capable at handling those classifications. It could be a little bit tricky. So again, we may want to consider handing that responsibility to a competent and capable customs broker. 2, customs officials, they collect duties. 3, they keep out goods that are not allowed to be imported into a country. And 4, they keep statistics. They keep import statistics. So these are the 4 duties that customs officials perform. And that is to the end of today's webinar, Executing a Global Sourcing Strategy. And I hope that you enjoyed the webinar and you found it informative. And again, in terms of who should handle which part of, I would say, a very, very intricate process, who should handle which part of the process is a decision to be reflected on and to be looked at in a very, very holistic way. And each part of the process should be handled by those who have the greatest degree of competency. And we should strike that balance between cost reduction or trying to get things done cheaply and look at the big picture and not put our organizations in a situation where there's some type of disruption because we have the wrong entities handling, or we have incompetent or incapable entities handling critical parts of this intricate function. So we have to look at things in a very, very, very balanced way. I mentioned earlier, we have to understand the degree of criticality of particular raw material inputs. Again, case by case, or if you categorize them, understand what are the 4% of raw material inputs that would drive 50% of the negative impact or pain on a supply chain if there's a disruption or if there's a delay in the acquisition of those raw material inputs. And then we look at the 20% of raw materials that would drive 80% of the negative impact on the organization, on our organizations and our customers if there's a delay or some type of disruption in the acquisition of those materials. So we look at the 80-20 and the 450 spectrum to reduce cost, total cost outside of the 450 and the 80-20. There may be some items that we have to procure cross borders or globally that do not have that degree of importance or criticality, then in this case we may consider if we could reduce costs on those items by handling those functions ourselves. So again, in terms of the raw materials that are not as critical, yes, we could look for some cost savings. The mere fact that they're not as important, not as critical to our supply chain, definitely we should come up with a low-cost solution in terms of moving those inputs across the supply chain. The ones that are, again, that have a high degree of criticality, we really have to think clearly and understand the cost impact and the brand damage that could be incurred if there's some type of delay. So that's how I would make that decision. It's more of a strategic approach in decision making, the 450 and the 80-20, leveraging those two rules. And that's it for today. Do we have any more questions? Okay, thank you for attending today's webinar. It was indeed a pleasure and an honor. And see you next week. We have 2 webinars next week. We have another retention and an informational webinar. Again, thank you for attending. Bye-bye. Have a great rest of the day.